Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will talk about the firm's financial objectives. This is our study plan. We have quite a lot of material to cover. We will start with the discussion of alternative forms of business organizations, how exactly the businesses can be registered, in what legal forms. Then we will proceed to the discussion of corporate objectives, alternative views on the corporate objectives. We will discuss for whom the company is run, and then we'll analyze what is the main financial objective of any business. We will come to a conclusion that what corporations are actually trying to do, they're trying to maximize shareholders' wealth. We'll compare shareholders' wealth maximization goal with profit maximization, because this is what we used to believe companies are trying to do in our economics part of the module. We always used to assume that firms are trying to maximize profit. And in this lecture, we will cover the practical problems which are associated with profit maximization as the firm's goal. And we will look at companies' goals from two viewpoints, from two angles, financial viewpoint and economics viewpoint. I will explain what financial management is, what are the types of financial managers' decisions, what is the role of the financial manager within the business. We will proceed to analyzing different types of stakeholders, an important concept. You will deal with it quite a lot during the rest of your course. Different types of stakeholders and possible conflicts between their interests which can exist in a modern organization. After this, we will focus on the principal agent problem, which occurs due to the separation of ownership from control in a modern organization, and we will cover possible solution to this problem. After this, we will finish with a brief discussion of corporate governance as one of the possible ways to address the principal agent problem. So quite a lot of material to cover. Let's proceed. Let's have a look at different types of business organizations or business forms. There are four main forms: sole proprietorships, partnerships, corporations, and hybrids. Let's have a look at sole traders first. These are businesses which are owned and operated by a single individual. The owner and the business are legally identical. The owner is legally responsible for company's liabilities or debts with his or her personal possessions. There are certain advantages of this type of business. For example, there is less paperwork to complete, the reporting requirements are low, the startup costs are minimal. However, it might be difficult to raise finance for this type of business, and the owner has unlimited liabilities for company's debts, which are its main drawbacks. Partnership is the second type of business, which is owned and controlled by two or more people who are equally liable for any losses. The positives for this type of business are the risk, which is shared between different partners. There are no public reporting requirements, a bit easier to raise additional capital if required. However, there is a drawback too. There are more admin costs, there is a slower decision-making process because all partners will need to come together to a single decision, and they still have unlimited personal liability for debts, unless you register your business as a limited partnership, which is one of its versions. Corporations is a type of business where liability is limited. If you invest in a corporation, if you register your business in this legal form, you are only responsible for the amount invested. This is the maximum which you can lose. And you cannot lose more if the company has made significant losses or has accumulated very large debts. Corporation is legally owned by its shareholders. However, it is legally separated from its owners. Corporations can hire individuals, they can make contracts, can sue and be sued. However, shareholders which own the corporation have nothing to do with its actions, and they're not responsible for the behavior of the corporation. And there are some hybrid forms of organizations too. In this module, we will focus mainly on corporations. Let's discuss what are the possible corporate objectives or goals of businesses. We used to believe that every company tries to maximize profit. This is one of the main assumptions in economics, and this is what we've been focusing on during the first part of this module. We assume that all companies are trying to maximize profit. But I mentioned in my previous lectures that this is not necessarily the case. This is correct in theory. This is what the economics is built upon. However, in practice, companies can deviate from this goal and instead they can pursue some other objective. For example, they can try to maximize their sales revenue. They can want to become a cost leader in the industry to capture the maximum market share by doing so. They may try to focus on creating an ever-expanding empire, like Amazon, for example, or Facebook. They might want to grow and start businesses in totally unrelated areas to their original business ideas. They can instead focus on employee satisfaction. They can try to pursue interests of their staff, of their workers. Or the company can simply focus on the survival if it's especially a difficult time. If the world is going through a period of crisis or global recession, companies can be interested in just mere survival rather than profit maximization. In finance, the assumption is that corporations are trying to concentrate on maximization of long-term shareholder wealth. So what companies are trying to do, they are trying to maximize the long-term wealth of their owners, of shareholders. In reality, it's somewhat similar to economics approach, because in economics we try to maximize profit, and profit is what shareholders get as a reward for their investment. This is what they get in return for their contribution. In economics, we've learned that there are 4 different types of inputs, factors of production: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. And the reward for entrepreneurship, for setting up businesses, is profit. When you try to maximize profit, you in fact maximize your return, the return to owners of the company, to shareholders. So strictly speaking, there is no conflict between these 2 objectives, but economics and finance just look at the same thing from a slightly different angle. So both of these goals are, strictly speaking, 2 sides of the same coin. Next question which we should address is, in whose interests should the firm be run? Because there are different people, different parties which are involved in management and running of any business, of any organization. For example, there might be company employees and managers who are apparently interested in the success of business. There might be customers who buy its products, goods and services produced by the firm. There might be creditors who provided some funds to this organization. Shareholders, the owners of the company, of course, has a very specific interest, very significant interest in the performance of the company. And society overall might be interested in how the company is doing and how it behaves. So the question is, whose interests should the company focus on? What it should do? Should it try to satisfy the shareholders only, or should it try to take into account the views and interests of other parties? All of these parties are called stakeholders. Stakeholder is an important concept, and if you did business studies at your A levels, you are probably familiar with this idea. Stakeholder is any party, any person, individual, or group which has some interest in the company, which can affect or be affected by company's operations. And this includes all of the groups which were shown on the previous slide, from shareholders, people who own company shares, employees and management, customers, suppliers, lenders, government and the general community, and many, many other parties. What you need to know is that all shareholders are stakeholders of the company, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. These 2 terms can sound very similar, but there are important differences. Shareholders are people who own shares of this organization. They are owners of the company. Every shareholder is a stakeholder. They have interest in company operations. While there are some other stakeholders, like the rest of the list, who do not own company shares, and therefore they are not shareholders. So don't confuse these 2 terms. Shareholders will receive return on their investment in the form of dividends and capital appreciation. This is their reward for their participation in this business, for taking part in setting up this business, for providing funding for them. They are, of course, directly affected by the financial performance of the company because it is reflected in the stock price and the value of their portfolio, their total wealth. The higher the stock prices, the higher the wealth of shareholders, because the assets, the value of assets in their possession is higher and they become richer. They feel richer when company shares go up. So apparently they're very interested and they're directly affected by the company's performance. What you also need to know is that stakeholders have different and frequently conflicting interests. There might be some conflicts of interest. For example, staff can be interested in higher wages, or customers could prefer to have better quality of services and lower prices. However, this will conflict with the interests of the shareholders, who might prefer to outsource the production to lower the costs, to increase profitability and get high investment returns. Very frequently, you won't be able to achieve or to satisfy everyone's interests at the same time. This table contains few other examples of these potential conflicts of interest. For example, staff and shareholders. Potential conflict is wage demand. Staff would prefer to have higher wages, while shareholders would prefer to reduce wages to reduce costs and therefore increase profitability of the company, the return on their investment. Another example, customers and community. Customers might prefer to have a new store built somewhere on a piece of a green-built land, while local community who lives nearby wouldn't want to have a very busy construction site and then a busy store on their doorstep. There is a conflict between interests of these parties. Customers and shareholders, again, as I've just mentioned, might have different views on service levels and product quality. Usually, to increase quality of service, product quality would require higher costs of production, and it would reduce profitability for shareholders, and you might need to find a balance between these two. There are some other conflicts between shareholders and lenders, for example, in terms of risk and reward on the lending provided, interest on borrowing the company gets. There might be a conflict between shareholders and managers who run the organization, principal-agent problem, which we are going to cover later. To summarize, different stakeholders which are involved with the running of the company have totally different objectives. They have conflicting interests which cannot all be satisfied at the same time. And that is why the company needs to decide which specific objective to focus on, which claimants will be able to have the objective maximized, in which interest the company will run its operations, and which stakeholders will only have to be satisfied but not maximized. So whose interest will be taken into account, but the company won't really attempt to please them as much as it could. There are alternative views on what the company can choose, how the company should answer these questions. For example, the pro-capitalist economists and scholars believe that businesses should pursue high returns for the owners of their organization. This is the main approach taken in economics and finance. Businesses should be run in the interests of owners. So the company should maximize profit or return to shareholders' wealth. Why is that? Because it's been proven since Adam Smith that the society is best served by businesses which are focusing on returns to themselves, on profit maximization. This is what we covered in the very first seminar when we studied 10 principles of economics. And I provided a quote from Adam Smith, which tells that any individual or business who pursues their own interests, who focuses on maximizing reward for themselves, will in fact increase society's welfare better than in any other way, because they are governed by the invisible hand of the market. Profit-seeking behavior results in the best allocation of resources because it directs businesses towards activities which create wealth for everyone. And profit-seeking, profit maximization attempts by businesses will result in the best allocation of scarce investment capital among competing projects and product lines. So as a result, consumers will get much more choice. They will get more quantity of goods which they want, because this scarce investment money is directed towards the best, most desirable uses. And apart from this, there is an argument that shareholders which own the company deserve any surplus it produces, because businesses create wealth for consumers, they produce valuable goods and services, they satisfy customer needs and wants, and businesses were created by shareholders, by their owners, who provided capital and entrepreneurial ability. Without them, there wouldn't be any businesses, and consumers wouldn't be able to enjoy the standards of living they have. They wouldn't be able to buy these goods and services services which they consume at the moment. As a result, shareholders should be rewarded for their efforts. They have the moral right to claim any profit which the company generates. This is the first view by pro-capitalists, and as I said, this is the main approach taken in economics and finance. There are other views, however. For example, the left-wing politicians and scholars believe that workers' rights and rewards should be the main goal for the organization. Workers work for the company, they create everything which consumers purchase, goods and services, and therefore they have the right for any surpluses which the firm creates. They should be rewarded for them. So the company should work in the interest of their staff, of their workers. This is the ideas, these are the beliefs of the left-wing parties and schools of thought. There is also a balanced stakeholder approach, and proponents of this approach believe that there cannot be any single overriding goal for the organization. Instead, the company can try to pursue the interests of shareholders, for example, owners of the organization. However, they must take into account the broader economic and social responsibilities. They need to become good corporate citizens, and they need to have good relationships with other stakeholders, with customers, employees, suppliers, and their interests must also be taken into account. And there is logic in this argument too, because if you ignore your customers, if you are only trying to maximize profit, strictly speaking, you won't be able to do this unless you satisfy customers, unless you provide them with the best possible quality of product, with the best possible after-sales service and lowest possible prices, because otherwise, in a modern competitive market environment, you simply will lose these customers, you will lose your market share. So that is why their interests will need to be taken into account. And strictly speaking, when you try to take all of these stakeholders' opinions and interests into account, you are most likely to be profitable as well. You are likely to create a successful business if you will manage to have good relationships with all of these stakeholders. This is what is called the balanced stakeholder approach. So to summarize, the main financial objective of the business, the finance approach, is to maximize the long-term shareholders' wealth. In other words, the company should make investment and financing decisions with the aim of maximizing shareholders' wealth. And as I explained, there are some theoretical and practical reasons for this. Businesses exist to create value, which means to make money for their owners, right? And shareholders' wealth can actually be measured by stock prices. So what the company can try to do, it can try to maximize the share price, the price of the company's stocks. And there are a few other equivalent goals which we will cover a little bit later in this lecture. And therefore, all financial decisions should be made accordingly, as they will affect whether this goal will be achieved or not. This idea, this approach, finance approach, that the main goal is the wealth maximization for shareholders, in fact, helps to resolve some problems with alternative objectives, some deficiencies of profit maximization, for example.